Wrestling journalism. Is it really journalism? With so many people debating the actual merits of professional wrestling reporting and whether or not it actually can serve a greater good, I figure now is the time to finally put it to the test. Which is exactly what we're gonna do, because today... This episode comes to you as a result of the polls over on Patreon, and while I'm at it, I want to give a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters, such as Jeff Ang, Cool Ass Jack, and Tom Hughes. Thank you so much for the support. Before we get into it, a real quick disclaimer. I am not singling out any specific wrestling news source, so if your favorite place for wrestling updates just happens to violate any of these ethical rules, well, that's on them and not on me. And with that out of the way, now, let's get into the episode. While there is no official set standard for how exactly the news is supposed to be conducted, there are many groups out there who have laid out their own criteria, and fortunately, many of them tend to agree for the most part. One such organization, which will be the foundation for today's video, is the Society of Professional Journalists. Founded in 1909, they are the oldest organization of their kind in the United States. They believe that public enlightenment is the forerunner to justice, and that ethical journalism strives to ensure an accurate, fair, and thorough free exchange of information. This is all summed up by their code of ethics. And that is exactly what we'll be exploring here today, as we'll take a look at some common wrestling news practices and see how they hold up against these principles. Now, the first principle is seek truth and report it. Ethical journalism should be accurate and fair. Journalists should be honest and courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information. An ethical journalist should take responsibility for accuracy of their work, verify information before releasing it, use original sources whenever possible. Okay, so let's take this apart bit by bit. In terms of using original sources, this comes from the concept that information is best when you can get it straight from the horse's mouth. For instance, if you find out that a student is missing class because they're ill, well, you might not be getting the most accurate report if you hear it like this.
My best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid is going with the girl who saw Ferris pass out at 31 Flavors last night.
Now, when it comes to the wrestling industry, it is notoriously not a transparent business. So that means that sometimes a news report is merely echoing what they heard from another report which allegedly got it from the original source. But that's not necessarily all that bad, because remember, the statement is whenever possible. And the regular news will on occasion do this too, as sometimes they'll cite another news report as being where they got their information from. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, as long as the place that they got their information from is a legit source and is following proper journalism practices. Although, just like with the telephone game, you should be aware that the more information changes hands, the more vulnerable it becomes to alteration. In addition to that, not having access to the original source does make the second part of that statement hard to do. Verify information. You have no real choice but to hope that whoever you got the story from got it right in the first place. Minimize harm. Ethical journalism treats sources, subjects, colleagues, and members of the public as human beings deserving of respect. A problem that can occur is that reports, such as the one stating that someone is a suspect in a crime, can damage a person standing within a community, even if it turns out that they're innocent. People tend to remember the accusation and the headlines more than the actual verdict. This covers a lot of ground, but I do think it's a very fundamental part of ethics. We need to remember that reports do affect people. And when it comes to wrestling news, it's sadly not always all that different from the kind of thing that grabs regular news headlines, as arrests and serious accusations have been made towards wrestlers as well. And whether or not the accused is found guilty, the accusation itself does still have an effect. To be clear, I'm not saying that accusations and arrests should not be reported on. I'm just saying that because a false accusation can sometimes follow someone throughout their entire career, that maybe in order to minimize harm, it should be reported on when someone is found not guilty with just as much energy and effort and fervor as it was when they were first accused to begin with. For example, a lot of people tend to forget that Vince McMahon was cleared of all charges for the steroid trial. But even knowing that, I'm willing to bet that many of you out there are saying to yourselves, "Come on, we all know he did it." See what I mean? Sadly, facts and evidence don't often change the way people feel about something, even when it should. And as Eric Bischoff said about the news,
they don't want you to think, they want you to feel.
Headlines such as "cleared of all charges" tend not to get as much attention as the ones that incite fear and anger. And media needs that attention in order to gain money, and since it's a business, well, their hands are tied, right? Well, act independently. The highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. The news is supposed to serve the people and not be up to the highest bidder. The facts aren't biased, so the news shouldn't be either. Because an ethical journalist should avoid conflicts of interest, real or perceived. Disclose unavoidable conflicts. Now, of course, this means that a journalist shouldn't be taking bribes that could influence their story. But in the greater context, what often gets overlooked is that bribery isn't the only way that money can corrupt journalism. Because the news is supposed to be a public service that works to create justice, but in many platforms, it requires money and views in order to stay viable. This becomes a juxtaposition of unrelated forms. Because now, is the top priority of the news serving the public or making money? Yes, in an ideal world, it would be able to do both. But when push comes to shove and one has to take precedence over the other, which one is the news going to pick? This practice results in clickbait, attention-grabbing headlines, and an emphasis on stories that are the kind that people want to hear rather than the kind that they should hear. This should make you wonder whenever you come across a wrestling news story, is this giving me factual information that could lead to a greater public conversation about fairness, or is it giving me rumor, gossip, and opinion? Because the difference can be a big deal. And finally, be accountable and transparent. Ethical journalism means taking responsibility for one's work and explaining one's decision to the public. It all comes around full circle, as this goes back to the very first crucial part of all this. Take responsibility. Because it's far too easy to pass the buck onto any of the sources that came before when someone gets secondhand information, or blame business as the reason why the news was skewed. An ethical reporter should own up to spreading non-factual, inaccurate information if ever they do so. However, when it comes to wrestling news, I do have to point out that a lot of what its audience is looking for tends to either be speculatory or subjective in nature, and in which case, a wrestling news source tends to use plausible deniability. For example, they could claim that there are reports of rumors that a specific storyline is going to happen, and even if that storyline doesn't happen, saying that there were rumors about it happening is still an accurate statement. Now, this is something of a gray area, and I also understand that beyond rumors just being false, sometimes plans change for a variety of reasons. But as far as I'm concerned, if you claim to have a backstage source that said something was going to happen and then it didn't, well, no matter what the reason, you should still be held accountable. Clarify that things went a different way, because I think it would actually increase public trust if you took ownership every single time you said something that didn't come to be, as that is exactly how you would be accountable and transparent. Ultimately, wrestling news can and has brought fairness to the industry. Wage discrepancies, covering major issues within the industry that the regular news just can't be bothered with, and exposing company practices that themselves are unethical have all been reported to workers, management, and the greater public in order to begin larger discussions. And that's really what it's all about. Journalists provide news, the news provides facts, facts provide the public with a greater conversation within a community, which can provide a call to action within society. But if the foundation of this is faulty, then the whole thing collapses. And yes, I do understand that in the grander scheme of things, wrestling news isn't the most important thing in the world. But it is still important to us, and within our community, we have the right to be properly informed. Well, there you go, ethics in journalism and how wrestling news stacks up. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and I also want to give a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters out there, just like these fine folks over here. Thank you so much for watching, and if you could please like this video and subscribe to this channel, it really does help. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.